I'd like to start by saying that it would be much easier to make my case if you forgot every instinct about which way to vote in this referendum, and if you tried to take a step backwards from the loathsome, on both sides, official debate around the referendum, because what we want to have tonight, I think, is much more a debate among progressive people about what stance to take on the European Union. And we have to decide that based not simply on the sort of narrow debate about what's best for Britain and what's going to happen to a house price and so on. We have to think in international terms, and we have to start from the question, what is the European Union and what does it represent, not just in Britain, but on the global terrain? And I want to start by saying that what the European Union more and more nakedly represents is neoliberal capitalism. And if you want to clear a single example of that, look at the actions of the European Union in Greece. If you look at Greece today, the institutions of the European Union, the Commission and the European Central Bank, they're not simply working with the International Monetary Fund, they're now going further than the International Monetary Fund. There was a debate over the last couple of days in which the IMF called on the European Central Bank and European Commission to show some restraint, to allow some debt reduction in Greece. The European Union effectively bullied the IMF into retreating on that and forced for a much harsher system of attacks on the Greek population. Already, under the Troika bailout agreement in Greece, you've seen a quarter of health budgets cut, a third of the education budget cut, 40% of children in poverty, all of this so that the Troika can help the banks and the institutions, the IMF and so on, claw back money that was borrowed by successive Greek governments, but which has been repaid many, many times over. In other words, if you look at Greece, what the European Union is doing is what the International Monetary Fund and World Bank have done to third world countries year after year after year. It's an absolutely barbaric programme. Not just in Greece. There is today a titanic battle going on in the streets of France between the government of François Hollande and the French trade unions and students. Massive battle, strikes, blockades and so on. Where does the European Union stand in that battle? The very attacks that Hollande is trying to drive through in France are attacks that were prescribed, supported and are being egged on by the European Commission in its recommendations to the French government. And they fit completely with a programme of automatic austerity that is enshrined in the fiscal compact signed by most European countries that says that if governments overspend, there'll be automatic processes of public sector cuts that begin to hit in, begin to impact. Add to this the TTIP agreement, the CETA agreement with Canada, the Trade in Services agreement, a whole range of free trade agreements being negotiated in secret by the European Union today, and we should see the European Union for what it is. A neoliberal capitalist institution, every bit as nasty as the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, or the G8. That's how we should begin to think about the European Union, and it's the reason why the bulk of capital, capitalist firms, every major bank in the world, the IMF, the CBI, the Institute of Directors, the American State Department, and so on, all support Britain staying in the EU. It's in the naked interest of capital and finance to keep Britain in the European Union. Secondly, it's against the interests of workers. It's obviously against the interests of workers in France and Greece and Spain and so on, but the European Union does nothing to protect the interests of workers in Britain. There's an argument which the Trade Union Congress is making that they say that thanks to the European Union, we have equal pay legislation, maternity leave, paid holidays, health and safety legislation and so on. You sort of think, well, if the European Union handles all these things, what's the point of trade unions then? And the reality is that all of these things that we have in Britain have been won through successive generations, hundreds of years of struggles, involving millions of workers who fought to actually wrest these reforms from the system. They don't come about because someone in Brussels decrees it. And because they won through struggle, many of them predate the European Union, and many of them go further than the European Union. Take the question of equal pay. The Equal Pay Act didn't come about because of the European Union. It came about because women workers at Ford Dagenham went on strike and they fought for it. And by the way, we haven't won equal pay. There's still a yawning pay gap between men and women, so we actually want equal pay. We have to fight for it. And years of membership of the European Union hasn't brought us to that goal of equal pay. Take health and safety legislation. We have, in Britain, weirdly, some of the best health and safety legislation anywhere in the world. And health and safety legislation is so good in Britain because it was fought for in a time of union strength and workers' militancy in the 1970s. The Tories talk about gold-plated health and safety legislation. And what they mean by that is they want to reduce British standards down to European standards. Many of the things that we've won as workers go way, way beyond those things enshrined in European legislation. All the EU offers is a basic minimum legislation you would expect in any free trade area anywhere in the world. It's a basic minimum. It's not the standard that we've attained where we've fought for those things. The third point I want to make is that even if you take the most compelling reason to support the European Union, the free movement of people, it's a right that comes at a very, very great cost. First of all, this is a right that is constantly being undermined in the European Union. If you look at Cameron's deal with the EU, this is partly about limiting the freedom to work and study abroad, which is the right that you have in the EU. But more importantly, we have to ask what the price of this is. Because the price of free movement in the European Union is the construction of a fortress Europe directed against those not lucky enough to be citizens of the European Union. There is simply no free movement if you're a Syrian refugee, an Afghan, an Eritrean desperately trying to come to Europe. What you face instead are Europe's border guards, Frontex, and the NATO fleet working hand in glove with the European Union policing the Aegean Sea. That's what you face if you try to come to Europe today. There is simply no free movement for people who are not EU citizens. And it's not only that, but the situation has become much worse. If you look at the deal that's been signed with Turkey recently, it's a deal that's so barbaric that it's been condemned by the UN, who pulled out of working in refugee camps on many of the Greek islands, and Amnesty International. It's a refugee trading deal in which they send people back to Turkey, a country that is currently waging war on a section of its population, bombing Kurdish villages and so on, with no right to claim asylum whatsoever. And the sum total of those Syrian refugees that we said we were going to take from Turkey is 177 who have been resettled across the European Union, out of 2.7 million living stranded in Turkey today. This is absolute barbarism. And the European Union is in the forefront of policing this system. That's what we mean by Fortress Europe. And because of that, the logic of Europeanism, the logic of a shared European identity, is underpinned by the same kind of nationalistic and racist myths that have underpinned British, French, German, Italian, and other forms of nationalism since time out of memory. And that's why both sides in this referendum debate are using racist arguments that we have to reject. It's not just the Little Englanders of UKIP and the Tory right and so on. Also David Cameron, one of his first actions in the referendum campaign was to go to France and say, if we leave the European Union, the desperate people in the jungle camp in Calais will be allowed to come to Britain. Brilliant. I've been campaigning for months for those people in the jungle camp in Calais to come to Britain. That's exactly what we want to happen. And the French government replied that if we leave the EU and the bankers all leave London, they'll run out a red carpet for bankers who want to come to France. Even better, migrants in, bankers out. That should be our slogan in this referendum campaign. Very, very strong reasons to leave the EU. But the honest argument is this. The only way to defend the rights of migrants from the EU and beyond is if we fight unified struggles of migrants and non-migrants to defend their rights. That's why I'm a proud member of Stand Up to Racism and why I've been working both to defend Eastern European migrants in recent years, but also to defend those coming from outside the borders of Europe. Two final points I want to make. The first is this. I'm sure that many people in this room would agree with many of these criticisms of the European Union. I'm sure that lots of people agree it's neoliberal and agree that it's persecuting refugees. The argument is that the European Union is reformable. I don't think the European Union is reformable. I want to explain why. The European Union is completely dominated in its day-to-day workings by unelected bureaucracies. The board of the European Central Bank, who voted for them? The European commissioners. Does anyone even know who the British commissioner is? Lord Orsford. And the clue is in the name. He's a lord. He's a Tory peer, and a former corporate lobbyist. And that's the person who represents us in the European Commission. Completely undemocratic. Celia Malmstrom, does anyone know who she is, the EU Trade Commissioner? She was challenged over the TTIP deal, and she was challenged by John Hillary, who some of you will know. What's she saying? I don't take my mandate from the European people. Absolute contempt for the democracy of Europe. And the reality, these bodies, along with the European Council, composed of the various governments of Europe, are the real bodies shaping European policy. Not the European Parliament, which doesn't even have the power to initiate new legislation, but these completely undemocratic bodies. Secondly, we want to fundamentally change things, you have to change the treaties of the European Union. How do you change them? You get unanimous agreement between 28 different countries. And if you win that unanimous agreement, why do we want to transform the European Union? Why not just build our own institutions from below? The notion you can transform the European Union in these ways is completely utopian. If we can't transform it, we should break it up and build a new kind of internationalism based on struggles from below. The very last point I want to make is this. The other fear that people have is that if we leave Europe, Britain will ultimately move to the right. And part of this argument is a completely spurious one, which is that somehow the European Union is holding back the Tories. Can anyone think of a single piece of legislation the Tories have wanted that the European Union has blocked in recent years? I can think of nothing the European Union has done to shield us from the massive assault being perpetuated by the Tories at the moment. But the reality is, this referendum campaign is not automatically going to shift Britain to the right. The consequences at the moment seem to be to rip the Conservative Party apart, to derail every single attack the Tories want to launch on us at this moment. And indeed, the only thing that can save David Cameron's political career is winning a big, stonking majority in this referendum campaign. If Cameron doesn't win a majority in this referendum campaign, Cameron is gone. Cameron is gone. Ken Clarke put it well. He said that he'll be gone in 30 seconds. He won't last 30 seconds. It's true. Are we afraid of Boris Johnson? Personally, I'm not. I'm not afraid of Boris Johnson taking over a damaged, divided, split Conservative Party and trying to function as Prime Minister leading that government. I think Boris Johnson will be gone very, very quickly. And anyway, is it really the job of the left to choose which is worse between Boris Johnson and George Osborne? I don't think so. I can't think of anyone nastier than George Osborne and David Cameron, to be honest. They're all as nasty as each other in the front ranks of the Conservative Party. That's not the choice we should be making. We should raise our expectations. I think if we vote to exit this referendum, the immediate consequence will be Cameron going. The next consequence will be a deep crisis for this government, which poses the possibility of the government falling. Under those circumstances, I would welcome a general election. I'd welcome an opportunity for Jeremy Corbyn to run to lead the next government. I'd welcome the space that would open up on the left for those of us who want to fight against neoliberalism and fight against racism. So for all those reasons, I would urge you to forget what your instincts are telling you, forget the mainstream debate and the nonsense that's been spouted for every quarter, and consider a left-wing internationalist vote for exit. Thank you.